Hi, welcome to the Azure Sentinel Notebooks channel. My name is Chi Nguyen, and I'm a program manager in Azure Sentinel Notebooks engineering team at Microsoft. And today, I want to talk to you about our 3 new notebooks, the notebook that can scan logs in your database environments. And if you take security seriously, you know how important it is to perform regular log scanning so that you can catch leaked credentials before they get into the wrong hands. And the cool thing is these are all out-of-the-box templates, so you can use them instantly without writing any lined-up code. All right, enough talking from me. Let's see a demo. So here I am in my Azure Sentinel workspace environment, and under this notebook blade, I have 2 tabs, right? My notebooks and templates. So you can see I don't have any notebooks yet. So I'm going to use some of the templates to get started. I'm going to search for Credential scan, and there are 3 notebooks in the result. These notebooks can scan logs in your most common storage environments in Azure Sentinel, such as Azure Log Analytics, Azure Data Explorer, or Azure Blob Storage. In this example, I'm going to use Credential Scan on Azure Data Explorer notebook, which essentially will scan the data in my ADX cluster to catch for any sensitive credential that may have been leaked. To do that, first thing first, I need to save this notebook to my Azure Machine Learning workspace. So in this case, I already have a default AML workspace, but if you don't have one already, you can easily create a new AML workspace using this button here. And from here, I have an option of renaming my notebooks, or I can just use my default named Credential Scan on Azure Data Explorer. Click OK. And my notebook now is saved to my AML environment. So from there, I can just launch notebook, and it's going to open up a new page, which is my Azure Machine Learning environment. And so from here, you will notice there are 2 new files that have been created. Main file for my notebook, which is this Credential Scan on Azure Data Explorer.ipynb, and another file which is config.json. So config.json will have information about my Azure Sentinel workspace, such as tenant ID, subscription ID, workspace name, etc. And this information is going to be used for Azure authentication part later in this notebook. All right. In terms of structure, the notebook will have 2 main sections. The first one, which is the documentation part, and the second part, which is the code part. Right. So documentation will tell you things like the version of this notebook. So in this case, it's version 1.0. It's going to use Python 3.6 running on Azure ML, and it doesn't require any packages. It's going to require Azure Machine Learning Notebooks platform, and you will need to have some data in your Azure Data Explorer tables. And so pretty much these are all the prerequisites that you will need for this notebook to run. Another thing to note is that for this notebook to work, you will need to have a compute instance, which basically is a server for your notebook. So in this case, I already created mine, which is Credential Scan LA compute instance, and it's currently running. But if you don't have a compute instance, you can easily create one by clicking this button and select the virtual machine that fits your notebook needs. Another thing I will need is a kernel. So it is an engine that executes the codes that contained in my notebook. And in this case, it's going to use Python 3.6 running on Azure ML. So going back to the documentation part of the notebooks, it's going to tell me what this notebook is about. So this notebook provides step-by-step instructions and also sample code to detect credential leak into my ADX environment, and it's going to use Azure SDK for Python and KQL, right? So it's also important to read through all of the instruction here, because it's going to help you avoid some of the most common errors, right? So in this case, it's going to tell you how to run it, right? So please run the cells sequentially to avoid errors. Please do not use run all cells. In terms of the contents, the notebook is divided into 3 main sections. The first section is warm up. So the warm up cells will load the Python libraries, parameters, and required functions that will be used in the notebook. The second section is Azure authentication, and this section allows the notebook to access my Azure resource group where my ADX environment is located. And lastly, Azure Data Explorer query section will allow me to choose an ADX cluster, a database from the cluster, and then a table that I want to scan. All right, let's get into the actions. So first, I'm going to execute the very first cell, which will install all the Python module that this notebook is going to use. And I'm going to wait for it to be done. Then I'm going to execute the second cell, which will load the first parameter that I'm going to use in this notebook, which is test run. Then similarly, I'm going to load the Python libraries that will be used in this notebook. Then I'm going to execute the next cell, which will load the functions that the notebook requires. And you can see that there is a regular expression list here that looks quite scary, but we already done this difficult part for you, so you don't need to write this. So that's a beautiful thing about template. All right, so the last cell of the warm-up section is going to call the previous function and populate the Sentinel workspace parameters, including tenant ID, subscription ID, workspace ID, etc. All right, moving on to the next part, Azure authentication. I'm going to go to this page that will require me to enter a code for authentication. So I'm going to copy this code first, go to this website, paste in the code, then select the user account that I'm going to use for this notebook, and going back to AML here, I'm going to execute the next cell. So it's going to allow me to select an Azure resource group. In this case, I'm going to use this resource group where my ADX cluster is located. Then the Azure authentication part is done. Now going on to the last part, which is the scanning part. So I'm going to execute the first cell of this third section. So I will need to select a cluster. In this case, I have a notebook cluster here. And then next, I will need to select a database from this cluster. So in this case, I have only one database, so I'm going to keep the default one here. And the next cell, I can initialize custom data client, and it's going to list all of my table from this database. All right, and then I can choose which table I want to scan. In this case, I have crash scan table. And moving on to the next cell, you will see that there's this note. It's saying you can specify a column that you want to scan in this particular table, or you can ignore this cell if you decide to scan all columns in this table. So in this case, I'm going to ignore this cell and not execute it because I want to scan all of the columns in my crash scan table. Then I'm going to select the next cell and it's basically will run the credential scanner, and it will list the credentials that are sensitive and that I will need to review. And then the very last cell, it's going to export all of these credentials into a CSV file so that I can download for review later. All right, so now I finished running my notebook, and I'm going to refresh this Notebook Explorer. Then now I can see a new file, CSV file, crescan _ADX, and I can just open this file to view the credential, or I can just download it and open it up in my desktop. All right, so now a question that you may ask, so where are all of these files? Like, where is the directory that store this configuration file and my notebook file and the output, the CSV file? So I'm going to show you where they are located. So there should be a storage account that is associated with your AML workspace. So here I have a storage account that was generated during my AML workspace creation step. And I'm going to get into my storage account, and under file shares, I'm going to open my user directory. And from here, I can see I have a configuration file here. I have the notebook file and also CSV file that was generated by the notebook. And one thing to note is that these files in the file share are accessible from all my compute instances in the same AML workspace. So any changes to these files on the compute instance will be reliably persisted back to the file share. So there you have it. 3 new notebooks that are simple to use, but they are very effective. Please do give them a try and let me know what you think. Oh, and before you go, I do have a question for you. Apart from these notebooks, can this log scanning process be created using other Azure Sentinel solutions, such as a playbook or a workbook? And if you think it is possible, I would love to hear your thoughts on the pros and cons of each of the solutions. Which one do you think is more efficient in terms of configuration, cost, and ease of use? I hope you find these notebooks useful, and thanks so much for watching.